The 17th century in England, it was basically a pressure cooker. Seriously. You had all these new ideas about science, love, and God, just slamming into old traditions of power. And it all led to a civil war that didn't just tear the nation apart, it tore its literature right down the middle, too.
It sounds like the start of a weird joke, right? But believe it or not, the answer connects two kings, a civil war, and some of the most mind-bendingly creative literature ever written. So stick with me, and we're going to unravel how these totally random things actually tell the story of a nation in absolute turmoil.
Okay, so here's the game plan. We're going to start with a new king and a wild terrorist plot that almost blew Parliament sky high. Then, we'll dive into some seriously brainy poetry, check out how writers were building whole new worlds with just prose, and finally, watch as the kingdom just descends into civil war, splitting its art right in two.
So, let's set the scene. The year is 1603. The legendary reign of Queen Elizabeth I is over, and England's about to get a brand new monarch. This kicks off what we now call the Jacobean era.
So you've got King James VI of Scotland. He heads south and becomes King James I of Britain. And the name for this whole period, Jacobean, it just comes from Jacobus, which is the Latin version of James. Pretty straightforward. But his arrival, it kicked off a totally new dynasty and, well, a very uncertain new chapter for England.
And I mean it when I say this new chapter almost started with a literal bang. Just 2 years after James takes the throne, this infamous plot is uncovered, the gunpowder plot. The plan was just insane. Blow up the king and the entire government. Poof! So the fact that it failed was a huge deal, and it cranked up the political and religious tension that would just simmer under the surface for the next 40 years.
Now, in the middle of all this tension, a totally new kind of poetry starts to bubble up. It was super intellectual, really philosophical, and honestly, it was unlike anything anyone had seen before. This was the age of the metaphysical poets.
The name itself kind of gives you a clue, right? Meta means beyond, and physical means the body. So these poets, guys like John Donne and George Herbert, they were trying to get their heads around ideas that were, well, beyond the physical world. They were wrestling with these massive themes, love, God, death, on a whole different intellectual level.
And they had this signature move, this literary tool they love to use, called a conceit. Now think of it like this. It's a super complex, really surprising metaphor that smashes two things together you'd never think to compare. And they did this to make you see the world and these huge abstract ideas in a totally new way.
And probably the most famous conceit of all time comes from a John Donne poem called A Valediction Forbidding Mourning. So he's about to go on a long trip, leaving his wife behind. And to explain their unbreakable connection, he compares their two souls to a drafting compass. Yeah, a compass. It sounds crazy, I know, but let's break down how this actually works.
Okay, so picture this. Donne says his wife is the fixed foot of the compass, the one that stays put right at the center. He's the other foot, the one that has to roam and travel all over the place. But, and this is the brilliant part, they're not separate. They're joined at the very top, which represents their two souls being spiritually linked. And here's where it all comes together so beautifully. As his roaming foot travels farther away, her fixed foot just leans in that direction. And together, they draw a perfect circle. That circle symbolizes the perfection, the wholeness of their love. It's this perfect form that guarantees he'll always come back to where he started, back home. I mean, it's just an incredibly clever and beautiful image, isn't it?
Okay, so while poets like Donne were mapping the inner world of the soul, other writers were looking outwards. They were dissecting society with prose and putting all its anxieties up on the stage for everyone to see.
In the world of prose, you've got this major figure, Francis Bacon. He's pretty much the father of the modern essay. And instead of using all this flowery language, Bacon's approach was almost scientific. He took this formal, objective look at huge topics like death and love and friendship and just tried to analyze them from every possible angle. But what's really fascinating here is how Bacon mixed this new, scientific way of thinking with old-school religious traditions. For instance, his magnum opus, the Instauratio Magna, was split into 6 parts. Why 6? Well, it was a deliberate echo of the 6 days of God's creation in the Bible. It's just a perfect snapshot of the time, isn't it? An era with one foot planted firmly in faith and the other stepping into the world of reason. At the same time, the theater was basically holding up a mirror to what everyone was worried about. On one hand, you had these dark, bloody revenge tragedies that were all about corruption and getting even, and on the other, you had these witty city comedies that made fun of all the greed and social climbing happening in London. Either way, you can really feel a society grappling with its own moral compass.
All right, so James I dies in 1625, and his son, Charles, takes the throne. This kicks off a new era, the Caroline period, and this is when all those tensions that were just simmering under his dad's rule, they're about to boil over into a full-blown war.
See, Charles I, he got his father's crown, all right? But he did not get his father's political skills. He just couldn't handle that delicate balance of power, and his reign is what ultimately pushed the kingdom right past its breaking point.
So where did it all go so wrong? Well, for starters, Charles was a Protestant king who married a Catholic princess. In Protestant England, that was a huge red flag. Then he started making up taxes without asking Parliament. But the final straw? He just straight up dissolved Parliament and ruled like a dictator for 10 years. The whole country was a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And in 1642, that powder keg finally exploded. The English Civil War begins. You've got the royalists, who are loyal to the king, fighting the parliamentarians. And after years of absolutely brutal conflict, the parliamentarians, with Oliver Cromwell at the helm, came out on top.
And what happened next was something no one could have possibly imagined. King Charles I was actually put on trial for treason against his own people. He was found guilty and he was publicly executed. This was an absolutely earth-shattering event. It was the first and, to this day, the only time a British monarch has been executed by their own subjects.
And of course, this massive national trauma echoed directly in the literature of the period. The world of poetry literally split in two, right down the middle, just like the country itself.
On one side, you had the Cavalier poets. Think of them as the king's men, courtiers and aristocrats like Robert Herrick and Richard Lovelace. Their poetry tends to be really charming, elegant, and full of witty lines about love, honor, and of course, being loyal to their king, even as things fell apart.
So let's put them side by side, shall we? The metaphysical poets were all about the soul, God, the afterlife, using this really complex, intellectual style. The Cavaliers, they were focused on the here and now. Their whole philosophy was carpe diem, seize the day. And there it is. That's the last piece of our puzzle from the beginning. This whole seize-the-day mindset, which came straight out of the chaos and uncertainty of war, is basically the great-great-grandfather of our modern you only live once. It's the original YOLO.
So there you have it, the failed terror plot, a drafting compass explaining love, and the seize-the-day spirit of the Cavaliers. It all paints this incredible picture of a literature trying to grapple with a world that's been completely turned upside down. And it leaves us with a question that, honestly, we're still asking today. In times of deep division, what's art for? Is it supposed to help us escape reality, or is it there to help us confront it?